Story NY Sandile. Welcome to our meditative journey to the galactic universe. In billions eons into the galaxy. The Sun God Meditation. Also known as Helios, SUREYA, Buddha, Christ, Krishna and thousand other names across the universe. As it was supposed to exist by the ancient philosophers. On the nature of this being or God, the ancient Oriental philosophers entertained opinions which took their rise from a very profound and recondite course.
Mr. Faber and different writers seem to bespeak only one formation or creation of man. The rise of the doctrine respecting the nature of God named above is said to be lost in the most remote antiquity. This may be true, but perhaps a little consideration will enable us to point out the natural cause from which, as I have observed, it had its origin. Like the discovery of figures or arithmetic, the septennial cycle, it probably arose among the first philosophers or searchers after wisdom, from their reflecting upon the objects which presented themselves to their observation.
Yet, when once put in train, a very obvious one, which arose out of the relation which man and the creation around him were observed by them to bear, to their suppose. Cause opinions which, though apparently well known to the early philosophers of all nations, seem to have been little regarded or esteemed in later times, even if known to them, by the mass of mankind. But still they were opinions which, in a great degree, influenced the conduct of the world in succeeding ages, and though founded in truth or wisdom, in their abuse they became the causes of great evils to the human race. From their philosophical truth and universal greeting in the world as we to refer the authors of the Neros, or to that enlightened race, supposed by Mons.
An absolute proof of this fact. But it is supported by reason and common sense, and by the traditions of all nations, when carefully examined to their foundations. The allegorical accounts or mythoses of different countries, the inventions of an advanced state of society, inasmuch as they are really only allegorical accounts or mythoses, operate nothing against this doctrine. When, after ages of ignorance and error, men became in some degree civilized, and he turned his mind to a close contemplation of the fountain of light and life of the celestial fire, he would observe among the earliest discoveries which he would make, that by its powerful agency all nature was called into action, that to its return in the spring season the animal and vegetable creation were indebted for their increase as well as for their existence. It is probable that for this reason chiefly the sun, in early times, was believed to be the creator, and became the first object of adoration. This seems to be only natural effect of such a cause. After some time this is nothing against the Mosaic account, because it is allowed by all philosophers, as well as most of the early Jews and Christian fathers, to contain a mythos or an allegory by Philo, Josephus, Papias, Pantonius, Irenaeus, Clemens Alex, Origen, the two Gregories of Nyssa and Nazianzen, Jerome, Ambrose, Spencer de Legibus Hebxorum, Alexander Geddes, the Romish translator of the Bible. The sun was the most powerful and beneficent agent, the solar fire was the most potent destroyer, and hence would arise the first idea of a creator and destroyer united in the same person. But much time would not elapse before it must have been observed, that the destruction caused by this powerful being was destruction only in appearance. That destruction was only reproduction in another form, regeneration, that if he appeared sometimes to destroy, he constantly repaired the injury which he seemed to occasion, and that, without his light and heat, everything would dwindle away into a cold, inert, unprolific mass. Thus at once, in the same being, became concentrated, the creating, the preserving, and the destroying powers, the latter of the three being, at the same time, both the destroyer and regenerator. Hence, by a very natural and obvious train of reasoning, arose the creator, the preserver, and the destroyer in India. Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. In Persia, Omists, Mithra, and Irenaeus. In Egypt, Osiris, Neith, and Typhon. In each case 3 persons and 1 god. And thus arose the Trimurti, or the celebrated Trinity. On this Mr. Payne Knight says, the hypostatical division and essential unity of the deity is one of the most remarkable parts of this system, and the farthest removed from common sense and reason, and yet this is perfectly reasonable and consistent, if considered together with the rest of it, for the emanations and personifications were only figurative abstractions of particular modes of action and existence, of which the primary cause and original essence still continued one and the same.
Described in Genesis by the words in Intu-Yubu, which mean a mass of matter effete, unproductive, unprolific, ungenerating, and itself devoid of the beautiful forms of the animal, vegetable, and mineral kingdoms, the mud or dws of Sankoniathon. The words of our Bible, as here used, without form and void, have not any meaning. The Son, the first object of adoration. The Trinity described above, and consisting of abstractions or emanations from the divine nature, will be found exemplified in the following work in a vast variety of ways, but in all, the first principle will be found at the bottom of them. We know nothing in the works of the ancient philosophers which can be brought against them except a passage or 2 of Plato, and one of Numenius, according to Proclus. Plato says, when, therefore, that God, who is a perpetually reasoning divinity, cogitated about the God who was destined to subsist at some certain period of time, he produced his body smooth and equable, and every way from the middle even and whole, and perfect from the composition of perfect bodies. Again Plato says, and on all these accounts he rendered the universe a happy God. Again he says, but he fabricated the earth, the common nourisher of our existence, which being conglobate about the pole, extended through the universe, is the guardian and artificer of night and day, and is the first and most ancient of the gods which are generated within the heavens. But the harmonious progressions of these divinities, their concussions with each other, the revolutions and advancing motions of their circles, how they are situated with relation to each other and their conjunctions and oppositions, whether direct among themselves or retrograde, at what times and in what manner they become concealed. How from these passages any ingenuity can make out that Plato maintained a trinity of the sun, the moon, and the earth, as the supreme God or the creator. The other passages of Numenius the Pythagorean, recorded by Proclus, who says that he taught, that the world was the third God, this is evidently nothing but the hearsay of hearsay evidence, and can only spew that these doctrines, like all the other mythoses, had become lost or doubtful to the Greeks. And it would not be till after ages of speculation and philosophizing that man would raise his mind to a more pure trinity, or to a trinity of abstractions, a trinity which would probably never have existed in his imagination if he had not first had the more gross corporeal igneous trinity, with its effects, for its prototype, to lead him to the more refined and sublime doctrine, in which the corporeal and igneous trinity gave way among philosophers to one of a more refined kind, or to a system of abstractions, or of attributes, or of emanations, from a superior being, the creator and preserver of the sun himself, then this fundamental doctrine on which, in fact, all the future religion and philosophy of the world was built, you attribute to accident. The word accident means, by us unseen or unknown cause, but I suppose, that when an intelligent being was establishing the present order of the universe, B must know how the unseen cause or accident which he provided would operate, this accident or unseen cause being only a link in a chain, the first link of which begins, and the last of which ends, in God. That the sublime doctrine of emanations, or abstractions as it was called, above alluded to, prevailed among the Oriental nations, cannot be doubted, but yet there may be a doubt whether they were ever entirely free from an opinion that the creative deity consisted of a certain very refined substance, similar, if not the same, as the magnetic, galvanic, or electric fluid. This was the opinion of all the early Christian fathers, as well as of the Grecians. But still, I think, certain philosophers arose above this kind of materialism, among whom must have been the Buddhists and Brahmins of India. We shall find this a most difficult question to decide. He obtrudes himself on our notice in every way. But what is there in the earth on which we tread, and which is nothing without the sun, which should induce the half-civilized man to suppose it an active agent, to suppose that it created itself? The unprolific mass required an exertion of metaphysical subtlety, infinitely greater than my Trinity must have required, arriving at pantheism so completely removed from the common apprehension of the human understanding. I am of opinion that had a neuter gender been known, it would have been applied to the deity, and for that reason would have been accounted, of the three genders, the most honorable. For this, among other reasons, if we find any very ancient language which has not a neuter gender, we shall be disposed to consider it to be probably among the very oldest of the languages of the world. This observation will be of importance hereafter. Of all the different attributes of the Creator, or faculties conferred by him on his creature, there is no one so striking or so interesting to a reflecting person as that of the generative power. Genesis. Chapter I. 38 Immortality of the soul and moral evil. This is the most incomprehensible and mysterious of the powers of nature.
The doctrine of a future state of existence, where the ills of this world would find a remedy, and the accounts of good and evil be balanced, where the good man would receive his reward, and the bad one his punishment. Had become purified from all stain, and in a state finally to be absorbed into the celestial influence, or united to the substance of the Creator. As it happens in every sublunary concern, the law of change corrupted these simple principles in a variety of ways, and we find the destroyer made into a demon or devil, at war with the preserver or with the Creator. Hence arose the doctrine of the two principles opposed to each other, of Oromasdes and Archimedes in perpetual war, typified by the higher and lower hemisphere of the earth, of winter and summer, of light and darkness, as we shall find developed in a variety of ways. Philosophers could not account for the existence of moral evil without the doctrine of the immortality of the soul. This difficulty has been overcome, as most theological difficulties usually are, among devotees, by a story. In this case by a story of a serpent and a fruit tree, except that, like most of the remainder of Genesis, it was anciently held to have an allegorical meaning, and, secondly, that we cannot do Moses the injustice of supposing that he, like the modern priests, could have meant it, at least by the higher classes of his followers, to be believed literally. Philosophers must content themselves with something less. Of the great variety of sects or religions in the world, there is not one, if the priests of each may be believed, in which any serious difficulties of this kind are found. Modern divines, a very sensitive race, have been much shocked with the doctrine of the ancients, that nothing could be created from nothing, ex nihilo nihil fit. This is a subject well deserving consideration. The ancients may have reasoned from analogy. They may have said, our experience teaches that everything which we perceive has pre-existed before the moment we perceive it, therefore it is fair to conclude that it must always have existed. A most hasty conclusion. All that at Carmel, close to the residence of Melchizedek, where was the temple of Lao, without image. When I formed the table of additional errata to my Celtic druids, I had forgotten where I found the fact here named relating to the residence of Pythagoras, which caused the expression of the doubt which may be seen through respecting it. Eternity of matter and renewal of worlds they could fairly conclude was, that, for anything which they knew to the contrary, it may have existed from eternity, not that it must have existed. But this amounts not to knowledge. Are the modern priests any wiser than the ancient philosophers? Have they any knowledge from experience of matter having ever been created from nothing? I think they have not.
A learned philosopher says, The bold and magnificent idea of a creation from nothing was reserved for the more vigorous faith and more enlightened minds of the moderns, who seek no authority to confirm their belief, for as that which is self-evident admits of no proof, so that which is in itself impossible Bible admits of no refutation. That the souls of mankind are emanations of that being. Socrates, the wisest of the ancient philosophers, seems to have believed that the soul existed before the body, and that death relieves it from those seeming contrarieties to which it is subject, by its union with our material part. Plato, in conformity to the opinions of the learned Hindus, asserted that God infused into matter a portion of his divine spirit, which animates and moves it, that mankind have two souls of separate and different natures, the one corruptible, the other immortal, that the latter is a portion of the divine spirit, that the mortal soul ceases to exist with the life of the body, but the divine soul, no longer clogged by its union with matter, continues its existence, either in a state of happiness or punishment, that the souls of the virtuous return, after death, into the source whence they flowed, while the souls of the wicked, after being for a certain time confined to a place destined for their reception, are sent back to earth to animate other bodies. Aristotle supposed the souls of mankind to be portions or emanations of the divine spirit, which at death quit the body, and, like a drop of water falling into the ocean, are absorbed into the divinity. Zeno, the founder of the Stoic sect, taught that throughout nature there are two eternal qualities, the one active, the other passive, that the former is a pure and subtle ether, the divine spirit, and that the latter is in itself entirely inert, until united with the active principle. That the divine spirit, acting upon matter, produced fire, air, water, and earth, that the divine spirit is the efficient principle, and that all nature is moved and conducted by it. He believed also that the soul of man, being a portion of the universal soul, returns after death to its first source. The opinion of the soul being an emanation of the divinity, which is believed by the Hindus, and was professed by Greeks, seems likewise to have been adopted by the early Christians. Macrobius observes, Animarum originum emanere de cielo, interrect philosophens indubitate constant esse fidei. Saint Justin says, the soul is incorruptible, because it emanates from God, and his disciple Tatianus, the Assyrian, observes, that man having received a portion of the divinity, is immortal as God is. Such was the system of the ancient philosophers, Pythagoreans, Brahmins, and some sects of the Christitans. Thus from trains of reasoning similar to what I have briefly described, and from natural causes, I think arose all the ancient doctrines and mythologies. The oldest philosophy or mythology, of which we have any certain history, is that of the Buddha of the Eastern nations, in which are to be found the various doctrines. From the metempsychosis arose the repugnance among the Buddhists to the slaughter of animals, a necessary consequence of this doctrine uncorrupted and sincerely believed. From this circumstance in the first book of Genesis, or Book of Wisdom, which is probably a work of the Buddhists, the slaughter of animals is prohibited or not allowed. After a time the mild doctrines of Buddha came to be changed or corrupted and superseded by those of Krishna. Hence in the second book of Genesis, or the Book of the Generations, or Regenerations S of the Planetary Forbes, Orient. Mem. Volume I Parkhurst, in Voce, 6, Guild. 42 Buddha Genesis bodies. In the third book, or the Book of the Generations, or Regenerations one of the race of man, the Adam, they are first allowed to be eaten as food. How long a time would elapse before man would arrive at the point I here contemplate the knowledge of the doctrines which I have described must evidently depend, in a great measure, upon the degree of perfection in which he was turned out from the hand of his Creator. On this point we are and we must remain in ignorance. The nurse begins with hobgoblins and ghosts, which are followed up by the priests with devils and the eternal torments of hell. How few are the men who can entirely free themselves from these and similar delusions and endless variety instilled into the infant mind. A learned philosopher has said, it is surprising that so few should have perceived how destructive of intellect the prevailing classical system of education is, or rather that so few should have had courage to avow their conviction respecting classical absurdity and idolatry. Except Bacon and Hobbes, I know not that any authors of high rank have ventured to question the importance or utility of the learning which has so long stunned the world with the noise of its pretensions, but sure it does not require the solid learning or philosophic sagacity of a Bacon nor a Hobbes to perceive the ignorance, nonsense, folly, and dwarfifying tendency of the kind of learning which has been so much boasted of by brainless pedants. All the doctrines above are well known to have been those of the most ancient nations. The theory of the origin of those doctrines is my own. But we beg leave to observe, that whether the theory of their origin be thought probable or not, the fact of the existence of the doctrines will be proved beyond dispute in a great variety of ways, and it is on the fact of their existence that the argument of this work is founded. The truth or falsity of the theory of their origin will not affect the argument. But of such persons as shall dispute the mode, these are the names which the books give to themselves. The sun or solar fire was the sole object of the worship of all nations, either as God himself, or as emblem or Shekinah of the Supreme Being. The sun the first object of adoration of all nations, the gods not deceased heroes. The Chinese have only one god, Hindu goddesses, toleration and change in religions. On the first view of the mythological systems of the Gentiles, the multitude of their gods appears to be infinite, and the confusion inextricable. But if a person will only consider the following chapters carefully, and without prejudice, he will probably discover a system which, in some degree, will unravel their intricacies, will reconcile their apparent contradictions, will explain the general meaning of their mysteries, and will show the reason why, among the various religions in later times, toleration so universally prevailed. But yet it is not intended to attempt, as some persons have done, a complete development of the minutiae of the mysteries, or to exhibit the perfect system intended with an explanation of the ceremonies and practices which the heathens adopted in the secret recesses of their temples, which they guarded from the prying eye of the vulgar with the greatest care and the most sacred oaths, and which have long since been buried amidst the ruins of the finest buildings of antiquity. Lamentable sacrifices to the zeal, bigotry, and fury of the iconoclasts, or of the professors of Christianity. Few persons have exhibited more learning or ingenuity on the subject of the ancient worship than Mr. Bryant and M. Dupuy, and whatever opinion people may entertain of different parts of their works, or of some of their hypotheses, yet they can scarcely refuse assent to their general assertions, that all the religions of antiquity, at least in their origin, are found to center in the worship of the sun, either as God the Creator himself, or as the seed of, or as the emblem of Creator. The Lord and first cause of all. And perhaps, though it can never be certainly known, those who only received the lesser mysteries, might confine their worship to the sun and the host of heaven, but it was only the vulgar and ignorant who bent the knee to the stone, wood, or metal idols of the gods, perhaps only a little more numerous than the images of the Christian saints. It has until lately been the general opinion, that the gods of the ancients were nothing but the heroes or the benefactors of mankind, living in very illiterate and remote ages, to whom a grateful posterity paid divine honors. This appears at first sight to be probable, and as it has an interesting account of the mysteries of the heathens will be found in Part 2 of Volume 2 of Dupuy's History of All Religions. The gods of the ancients not deceased heroes served the purpose of the Christian priests, to enable them to run down the religion of the ancients, and, in exposing its absurdities, to contrast it disadvantageously with their own. It has been, and continues to be, sedulously inculcated, in every public and private seminary. The generality of schoolmasters know no better, they teach what they have learned and what they believe. But, as this rank of men increase in talent and learning, this is gradually wearing away. Although the pretended worship of heroes appears at first sight plausible, very little depth of thought or learning is requisite to discover that it has not much foundation in truth. It was not in the infant state of society, that men were worshipped. It was not, on the contrary, until they arrived at a very high and advanced state of civilization. It was not Moses, Zoroaster, Confucius, Socrates, Solon, Lycurgus, Plato, Pythagoras, or Numa, that were objects of worship, The benefactors of mankind in all ages have been oftener persecuted than worshipped. No, divine honors, if such they can be called, were reserved for Alexander of Macedon, the drunkard, for Augustus Caesar, the hypocrite, or Heliogabalus, the lunatic. A species of civil adoration, despised by all persons of common understanding, and essentially different from the worship of the Supreme Being, was paid to them. It was the voice of the moment, and soon passed away. How absurd to suppose that the elegant and enlightened Athenian philosopher could worship Hercules, because he killed a lion or cleaned a stable. Or Bacchus, because he made wine or got drunk. Besides, these deified heroes can hardly be called gods in any sense. They were more like the Christian saints. Thus we have Divus Augustus, and Divus Paulus, and Divus Petrus. Their nature has been altogether misunderstood, it will afterward be explained. After a life of the most painful and laborious research, Mr. Bryant's opinion is, that all the various religions terminated in the worship of the sun. He commences his work by showing, from a great variety of etymological proofs, that all the names of the deities were derived or compounded from some word which originally meant the sun. Notwithstanding the ridicule which has been thrown upon etymological inquiries. Ausonius represents all the deities to be included under the term Dionysus. Sometimes Pan was called the god of all, sometimes Jupiter. Ananias also states, that all the different gods, whatever might be their names, Hercules, Ammon, Apollo, or Mithra, centered in the sun. Mr. Selden says, whether they be called Osiris, or Omphis, or Nilus, or Cyrus, or by any other name, they all center in the sun, the most ancient deity of the nations. Basnages says, that Osiris, that famous god of the Egyptians, was the sun, or rather the sun was the emblem of the beneficent god Osiris. Serapis was another name for the sun. Ramesius gives an inscription to Jupiter the sun, the invincible Serapis. Mithras was likewise the sun, or rather was but a different name, which the Persians bestowed on the Egyptian Osiris. Because the sun was worshipped with a reverential silence. Who had their origin from Egypt. 1. By the Syrians the sun and heat were called in Rachmne, Chamha, 2. And by the Persians Hama. 3. Thus the temple to which Alexander so madly marched in the desert, was called the Temple of the Sun or of Ammon. Mr. Bryant says, the worship of Ham, or the sun, as it was the most ancient, so it was the most universal of any in the world. It was at first the prevailing religion of Greece, and was propagated over all the seacoast of Europe, from whence it extended itself into the inland provinces. It was established in Gaul and Britain, and was the original religion of this island, which the Druids in after times adopted. This Ham was nothing but a Greek corruption of a very celebrated Indian word, formed of the 3 letters Aum, of which I shall have much to say hereafter. Virgil gives the conduct of the year to Liber or Bacchus, although it was generally thought to be in the care of Apollo. It also appears from the Scholia in Horace, 10 that Apollo and Dionysus were the same. In fact, they were all 3 the same, the sun. It is allowed that the grand mysteries of the Grecian religion were brought by way of Thrace from Assyria, Persia, Egypt, or other eastern parts, by a person of the name of Orpheus, or at least that it carned from those parts, whoever brought it into Greece. And in the doctrines attributed to this philosopher, we may reasonably expect to find the groundworks of the religion, in fact, the religion unadulterated by the folly of the populace, and the craft of the priests. And here we shall find a pure and excellent religion. Proclus says of the religion, Jove is the head and middle of all things were made out of Jove. According to Timotheus, in Cedrenas, Orpheus asserted the existence of an eternal, incomprehensible being, the creator of all things, even of the tether itself, and of all things below that ether. According to him, this is called life. And Suidas says, that these 3 names express one and the same power. And Timotheus concludes his account by affirming